Michelle Levine, CEO, Roy Morgan Research.
Good morning, everyone. Now, Julian McCran, I don't think has arrived yet. Julian,
Always late.
yeah, he's always late, but he does a really good job, so we kind of put up with it. But I have to say, Julian put together all of this research. So the research comes from, of course, the Morgan poll, from our traditional research into other areas like the single source, but there's also quite a lot of political research that you need to do just to make sense of it, and that's what Julian has done. And even though I've thanked him now publicly, he doesn't even know. So there you go. So welcome everybody. This is the Roy Morgan State of the Nation. It's in fact our 24th report, and as Gary said, we're putting a spotlight on politics. So the Australians go to the polls in just over 2 weeks, Saturday, July 2. Who will be Australia's Prime Minister after the federal election? Will it be Malcolm Turnbull? Will it be Bill Shorten? Well, our research shows that almost a third of Australians would vote for an other. They'd vote for somebody other than Bill Shorten or Malcolm Turnbull if that other person they wanted to vote for was standing in their electorate and if the election were held today. So that's a pretty important starting point, isn't it? That's where the election starts. A third of us would not vote for one of the major parties given the opportunity. It's been called the most boring election ever. We keep hearing electors are really disappointed. So what's actually happening? There's actually a lot happening. This is not a boring election, in my opinion. We see wage fraud, massive wage fraud, with so far very few consequences for those people who are responsible. We see unions and large employers getting together, making illegal agreements to pay workers below award rates. And we're not, what happens about that? So Roy Morgan did a poll of 1,503 electors, so 1,500 electors. The vast majority, 77%, said the federal government should establish a national crimes authority to investigate this issue of unions and large employers getting together to pay workers below award rates. That won't happen, but that's what people want. In Victoria, and I spoke about this in Sydney yesterday, it was probably less of an issue, but in Victoria, the unionisation of the CFA, the Country Fire Authority, and its volunteers saw the resignation of the Emergency Services Minister and the Labor Leader Daniel Andrews sacking the board of the CFA for standing up against unionisation of the volunteers. So these things should have, you would expect them to have a big effect at the polls, a big effect on how we're wanting to vote. But in Victoria so far, our data's not showing a single blip. It hasn't actually been reported. Now, is the sound okay at the back of the room, or do I need to turn the sound up? A little bit higher, okay?
Sounds better than Gary.
Great, okay. A Greens leader, Richard D Natale, is no Bob Brown. D Natale owns a $2 million farm that was not declared in the relevant registry until he was asked to declare it. He's been accused of underpaying au pairs that he hired, $6 an hour, but he claims he had to take things like food and rent out of the amount of money that was being paid. Did he pay superannuation? Did he take the super out and then pay it to the relevant authorities? Did he declare the income that he received from the rent that he was paid for somebody staying in his house? Did he pay work cover, or did he break the law? And is that okay? Is that okay if you're Green? So the Greens leader also apparently has no idea how steel is made, because he's come out very strongly in support of iron ore, but very strongly against coking coal. You need coke and coal to make steel. So these things are issues that sort of are really happening in this election, far from boring. And speaking recently at a campaign in San Diego, in California, Donald Trump said, "We have tremendous deficits." He was talking about America, obviously. "Don't believe the 5% unemployment," he said. "It's more like 20%. This US Republican candidate, Donald Trump, is the only leading US politician to really speak about the true levels of unemployment in the United States. But nobody in Australian politics is coming clean on real unemployment in Australia. If we saw this level of dishonesty going unchallenged in an economically backward dictatorship, we'd all sort of pat ourselves on the back and say, gee, aren't we glad we live in a democracy with the rule of law, i.e. that wouldn't happen here. We really just don't seem to understand. And I know, as I've done my own kind of private research, just talking to people I know who are intelligent, knowledgeable people, you say to them, what do you think about the unions getting together with big business and doing these things? And they go, oh, so what was it again? What happened? Or they'll say, no, well, I don't actually think people should be paid double time on Saturday and Sunday. I'm going, that is not the point. That is not the point. There's a really important issue going on here. We've got unions and big business getting together to do things that are illegal. They go, oh, I haven't really followed it. And on every one of these issues that I think has really deep, important impact for Australia, my friends, my intelligent friends, are kind of on the periphery. So what it means is that there are lots of things going on. We, the electors, only tune in to certain things that sort of affect us. And that's a really important fact. But anyway, I think it's a very important election. When Tony Abbott was elected in 2013, we at Roy Morgan said the new federal government needs to tackle the real issues. It needs to increase workplace productivity. We were talking about 24/7 opportunities for people to work. Really tackle unemployment and underemployment by eliminating those outdated award rates. Not doing deals with the unions. Get rid of the wrong award rates. We said they need to eliminate the cash economy. We said they need to really apply the rule of law, and that means jail for people and governments that are corrupt. So politicians, public servants, judiciary, business leaders, including tax evaders, make the rule of law work. We said you need real competition in the private sector, open government tenders, accurate government data. We also said Canberra should be closed. Today, what we would say is let's think about moving Canberra to South Australia. Think about it. It's a really good idea. Sleep on it. Wouldn't that solve a lot of problems? You'd solve all the problems in Canberra. That's what you do. You bust things up that aren't working, and you'd put it in a place that desperately needs jobs. So you heard it here first. Anyway, the point is those are the things that we were saying when the Tony Abbott government came in. Nothing's changed. In fact, it's even more clear, given all of the things that are happening, that are emerging now, they were happening all along, it's clear that what needs to happen. So let's have a look at some, I suppose, political analysis, the political context, because as I said, not everyone's thinking about these things all the time. The issues as the electorate sees them, what we see as some of the sleepers or wildcards. But first, let's have a quick snapshot look at Australia, where we are today. So when we at Roy Morgan ask Australians what are the biggest issues facing the world, you'll actually see things like the environment, the economy, and terrorism and war are vying for top position. They are all kind of equally important as worries for Australians on the global scene. When it comes to Australia, back home, the big issues, it's really clear it's the economy. Way, way out, there's a big gap between the issue of the economy and everything else. And it's the issue of the economy, including things like the cost of living, unemployment, the budget being balanced, everything to do with economic things. And you can see here, it wasn't always so. You know, in the early days in 2005, our biggest worry over here, this red line, was war and terrorism. That was when the first Bali bombings were happening. Then we saw the green line, the environment was the biggest issue. But you know, since about 2011, it's always been the economy. And so this is a really important issue for Australians, and the election will be fought on the economy. There are lots of economic measures, but as most of you know, we at Roy Morgan think the key ones are consumer confidence, business confidence, government confidence, and unemployment. So where are we? Consumer confidence, the latest consumer confidence that came out yesterday from Roy Morgan with the ANZ Bank is sitting at 116.4. That's a kind of respectable level of consumer confidence. It's way above 100, which is that midline where people are equally positive and negative. So that's still fairly solid. We're seeing business confidence also respectable, but not super good at 111.9. Now, when Tony Abbott was in power, just before Malcolm Turnbull took over, that was down at around 98, so it had dropped below that magical number. Business was fairly pessimistic. The sector of business that's actually keeping that consumer confidence, the business confidence up, is big business. It's actually tipped up in the last little while. The other numbers here we see are real unemployment, Roy Morgan real unemployment at 10.7, and underemployment, that's people who are working part-time but want more work. They're underemployed at 7.4% of the workforce. And the broad economic figures, and these are predominantly provided by the ABS, show that there are some challenges facing the Australian economy. Inflation is pretty low, and actually the March quarter was a quarter of deflation. It was negative. Interest rates are low by Australian standards, so there are plenty of people who are living off savings and retirement funds who are really feeling the pinch. Of course, people with mortgages are feeling kind of okay, but while our interest rates are low by Australian standards, they're relatively high by standards around the rest of the world. And then on a two-party preferred basis, our Roy Morgan latest poll, which is a multi-mode poll, conducted in the middle of June, shows that the LNP government is sitting at 49%, playing the ALP at the remainder 51%. So Labor's ahead of the government. That's still a winning position for the LNP, but it's pretty close. And we see government confidence, Roy Morgan government confidence at 102, which means that there are slightly more people thinking the country's going in the right direction than think it's going in the wrong direction. So this is a kind of quite divided situation. And if we look then at the broader political context in review, Malcolm Turnbull successfully challenged Tony Abbott about 9 months ago in September 2015, and he got an immediate large boost in support. So voting intention swung to the LNP. Consumer confidence went up. Government confidence went up. Business confidence went up. Everyone went, wow, the Messiah's come, this is fantastic. And then it faded away. So that's the sort of political context that we're in at the moment. And in fact, by the time that Malcolm Turnbull called this double dissolution election, the LNP was behind in the polls. At the last election, September 2013, the LNP won government with a really strong majority, 53.5% on a two-party preferred vote. So obviously the ALP got the remainder, 46.5%. And that gave the LNP, the government, 90 seats in the House of Reps. Now that 90 seats out of 150 is a really big number. It's in fact the largest share that a government's had in the lower house since the Howard government in 1996 to 1998. So that's strong. The size of that majority, the 90 seats, is actually a major challenge facing opposition leader Bill Shorten if he attempts or as he attempts to win the federal election, particularly after only one term in opposition. So typically Australians don't throw out a government after their first term. And in fact, historically, as Julian, who's now arrived, everyone note Julian came late, historically, as Julian points out, there hasn't been a one-term government in Australia since the 1930s. So, historically, it's going to be kind of hard for Bill Shorten to turn that around. The coalition holds most of its seats in only two states, New South Wales 30 and Queensland 22. So that's 52 seats out of the 90. That means the next federal election will once again be fought largely in New South Wales and Queensland. But there's a rising challenge, as we all know, facing the Turnbull government, particularly in South Australia, where the coalition holds 6 of 11 seats. And that's the new Nick Xenophon team, or NXT as they call themselves. So the Xenophon team is polling very strongly in South Australia. The latest Morgan poll shows them polling at 26.5%, well over a quarter, and with a chance of winning several seats, including some of Mayo, Boothby, Hindmarsh, Grey, Kingston, Sturt and Barker. and perhaps others, despite the latest preference deals. Because, of course, preference deals are really a suggestion, aren't they? The voter can still make their own choice. And when you've got a party or a person like Nick Xenophon, you can imagine people actually choosing to make their own call on how their preferences flow. So preferences deals are important, but they're not the be-all and end-all. So is the swing on? The ALP, if they're to deprive the coalition of a majority in Parliament, not to win, but to stop the coalition being completely in charge, need a swing of 3.7% if there's an equal national swing across the country. To actually win government, they'll need a uniform swing of about 4%. Now, history suggests that the Turnbull government will be returned with a majority of about 80 to 84 seats. Really unlikely that the ALP would get a 4% swing. The last time that happened was with Bob Hawke, who got a swing that was over 5%. Other than that, pretty much unheard of. So it suggests the Turnbull government will be returned. Now, these swings clearly, if you think about a national swing, it doesn't always happen as a national swing. It's more normal and national than we tend to think. It doesn't all just happen in the marginals. But this sort of swing doesn't take account of the specials and perhaps unexpected results, including the Nick Xenophon team maybe winning a seat in South Australia, or the Greens winning an additional seat in the House of Reps. So let's look at how that might play out. And just to make a point, there are at least two candidates who think there's a good chance that we'll have a hung parliament. So both Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott, who had left after not having much of a chance, have again put their hands up for a crack at Parliament. So apparently the prospect of another hung Parliament is just too tempting for both of these country independents. So these things make the election interesting, I think. So if we analyse the voting trends in South Australia this year, what we see is the Nick Xenophon team is performing most strongly in Liberal-held seats. Now, when you look at this data, all a challenger party needs to do is do a little better than the second party. We don't have a first past the post voting situation. So a challenger has to do better than the second one, then the preferences do all the work. Now, Nick Xenophon team has outpolled Labor in the Liberal-held seats of Mayo, that's the one held by Jamie Briggs at the moment, and Sturt, held by Christopher Pyne, fairly important, and is also polling a significant share of the vote in the largely rural seats held by Liberals of Barker and Grey. The seat of Grey covers the northern South Australia, and during this polling period, as we know, the largest employer in Grey, iron ore miner and steel maker Arium, has been placed into administration, threatening thousands of jobs. So this is the big news in South Australia. So those troubles for Arium will actually provide a further boost for the Nick Xenophon team because Nick Xenophon has come out strongly in support of keeping the company Arium alive, regardless of the cost. So essentially he will pick up support for that kind of activity. And so really what we see is the results in several of these South Australian seats in the House of Reps will come down to the flow of preferences. Flow of preferences will be really important in this election. And of course, it's not just Nick Xenophon, it's the whole team. And it's likely that they'll actually have a number of seats in the Senate, so we'll see these people. When we look at the voting trends across different states, we see that the NXT or the Nick Xenophon team supporters come from across the political spectrum. And we say that because when we look at their second preferences, across Australia, voters for the Nick Xenophon team are splitting 50-50 in their second preferences, Labor versus LNP, when they're asked for a second preference. In South Australia, the Xenophon team is marginally more in favour of the Labor Party. It's running about 53 to Labor, 47 to the LNP. Now, the Xenophon team support around the rest of Australia rather than South Australia is still quite low. So it ranges from something like 2% in Western Australia to about 3.5% in New South Wales, Queensland and Tasmania. So, and also that means that he won't be standing or they won't be standing candidates in all of the seats. So it's unlikely to make a huge impact in the lower house outside South Australia. But the NXT is attempting to snare a Senate seat outside South Australia, if possible. And as we'll see in a minute, a Senate vote of even 4 or 5% might be enough to win the final Senate spot outside South Australia. When we look at the Greens, the voting trends around Australia show the Greens are polling over a quarter of the vote in around 7 seats around Australia, including 4 Victorian seats of Batman, Gellibrand, Melbourne, which they already hold, and Wills, and including 3 New South Wales seats of Grayndler, Richmond and Sydney. Now, of course, the Green vote always shrinks when you come to an election. It's a phenomenon we continue to see. The Green vote is a bit like not one of the majors. When it comes to the election, a whole range of things happen, like they're not standing at every seat. People realise they need to make their vote count, and in fact, the Green vote always sort of dissipates. But the decision by the Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull to direct Liberal preferences to the Labor Party over the weekend, in return for Labor preferences to the Liberals in 3 key rural seats, means the LNP will easily retain some of these seats. So these cross-preferencing deals are really looking to be designed to keep the Greens out. But the Greens look set to retain the seat of Melbourne, led by Adam Bant, and still have a really good chance of winning the seat of Batman over the incumbent David Feeney, who's an ALP person. Feeney's had quite a lot of bad publicity during the election campaign over issues like his negatively geared property and not being fully aware of key Labor policies. So, the Greens are looking strong, but as we said, they normally come back 3 to 4 percentage points, and we've got preference deals being done that would not favour them. So as already mentioned, on a 2-party preferred basis, we've got, in fact, the Labor Party slightly ahead. If we look at the trend over this time since Malcolm Turnbull took over, you see the moment he took over, this amazing swing. So Malcolm Turnbull factor was extraordinary, 43 to 57.5 for the LNP, held for a while and then started to travel down with some times when there was an overlap and the ALP was ahead. And as at the time when Malcolm Turnbull went to the election, you see the Labor Party was really strong. They're coming back together again. Just briefly, it's not an unusual phenomenon to see the government, whatever the party is in government, the electors want someone else. We historically see that. It's almost like until the election, we all want something different. We're going to tell them what we think, we want somebody else. So really the time that matters is at election time. And what we see consistently is come to an election, they always come together. So it's very interesting to look at voting intention in between because it's a sign of, I suppose, frustration of the people, but it's only really at voting time that it matters, and that's when it becomes really close. So while, as I said before, Malcolm Turnbull's government controls 90 out of 150 seats in the House of Reps, it only controls 33 out of 76 seats in the Australian Senate, and that's the problem. This dysfunctional Senate situation was the real reason, or the major reason given by the Prime Minister for calling a double dissolution federal election in an effort to clean out the Senate and give the government the chance to pass legislation, including the ABCC bill, and that's the Australian Building and Construction Commission. But there's certainly no chance that this Senate is going to be any more favourable to the LNP than the past one was. There'll be more minor party senators after the election than there are now. As usual, at the federal election, Australians have this situation where when you have a Senate, normally you need to get 14.2% of the vote to get a senator in because you're electing 6 senators. When you've got a double dissolution, you actually are going to be electing 12 senators, so they get a different share of the vote. You only need to get just over 7% of the vote to get a Senate seat. And that's why, and of course preferences play. So if you get 4 or 5% and the preferences flow your way, with that small percentage you can actually get a Senate seat. So that's why we expect that we'll see more independents or minor parties having Senate seats than even previously. So while it looks like there'll be just as many different people, different crossbenchers, there'll probably be a different makeup. We'll actually be saying goodbye to Clive Palmer, who founded the Palmer United Party just before the federal election and recently has been polling 0. Thank you, Julian. I would never have put a slide like this in, but Julian made the point that it's sinking like the Titanic. The Nick Xenophon team that we've already talked about looks really certain to win 3 Senate seats in South Australia and will be hoping to snare a 4th seat and perhaps another seat somewhere around Australia. Jacqui Lambie, the JLN, Jacqui Lambie Network, looks set to retain her seat in Tasmania. Glenn Lazarus is in with a chance of winning his Senate seat, although there might be competition from Pauline Hanson, the One Nation member, over that final Senate seat in Queensland. Maybe both will be elected. That would be interesting. John Madigan looks set to end his stay in the Senate after 6 years as, first of all, a Democratic Labor Party senator and then an independent, and now he's running his own brand name party, John Madigan's Manufacturing and Farming Party. I thought it was the male and female party. He almost got my vote. And media personality Darren Hinch has also started his own party, not surprisingly, called the Darren Hinch Party, and he will be in with a chance of grabbing the last Senate seat in Victoria, which might come down to how many people make the decision to fill in all the preferences. Again, he won't be preferenced, but people might like him and he might be preferenced by people. Family First Party Bob Day stands a good chance of re-election in the Senate with the reduced quotas, that issue that you only need to get maybe 4 or 5 to get over the line with the 7% thing. So that might ensure that he gets back to return to Canberra after the election. And David Leonhelm, the Liberal Democratic Party. Now, he hasn't this time drawn the first position on the New South Wales Senate ballot paper. Last time on the ballot paper, he came first. Now, you wouldn't think that matters, but we know time in and time out, 22% of Australians make up their mind how they're going to vote in the polling booth. So you can imagine being top of the list is quite a good place to be. Now, this time he hasn't drawn top. This time he's drawn 4th on the ballot paper. So he's ahead of the Liberals at 6th. And there's some suggestion that all of the excitement about him being elected last time, because he was first on the ballot paper, might give him the kind of popularity or notoriety that gets him through again. Let's wait and see. So since Malcolm Turnbull came to power, he's had a really strong lead over Bill Shorten in the leaderships or popularity stakes and continues to be well ahead. So we actually have, in terms of the preferred Prime Minister, Turnbull at 57%. It's down, but it's still much stronger than Bill Shorten at 24%. And in terms of their job approval, Malcolm Turnbull's job performance, do people think he's doing a good job? Slightly more think he's doing a good job at 43% than say he's not doing a good job or disapprove at 41%. On the other hand, Shorten has many more disapproving of the way he's handling his job at 49% than approving at 34%. So Malcolm Turnbull is way ahead in these popularity stakes. And when it comes to who Australians want as the leader of the Liberal Party or the LNP, clearly Malcolm Turnbull is the preferred leader. And he's way ahead of Julie Bishop and way ahead of former Prime Minister Tony Abbott. If we look briefly at the trends, you can see how Malcolm Turnbull came from, quite a low position to a very strong position. It's come off a bit, but it's actually still way ahead of Julie Bishop at 24%. And you can see Tony Abbott has lost his position as preferred leader, well and truly. If we look then at LNP supporters, those people who support the party anyway, it's a similar position. The lines are clear. You've actually got Malcolm Turnbull way out there ahead of Julie Bishop. On the other hand, if we look at the opposition, if we look at Bill Shorten, very, very different picture. We've actually got the preferred, and if we look at the trends, it's even more fun. So Tanya Plibersek, clearly preferred leader over Bill Shorten, and in fact preferred over Anthony Albanese and then Bill Shorten. If we look among Labor voters, you see Tanya Plibersek 23%, way ahead. Again, Anthony Albanese and Bill Shorten line at 18%. This will be important after the election. Of real concern, though, is that Australians actually don't rate our politicians for honesty and ethics. Our latest image of professions, conducted in May, shows that federal MPs, politicians, only 17% of Australians vote them highly for honesty and ethics. That's way, way lower than all the good guys like nurses and doctors and engineers and the police. I think we have a police person here. So federal politicians are nowhere near as good as that. They're kind of a roundabout talkback radio announcers. and union leaders, somewhere between the two. But they are ahead of stockbrokers, insurance brokers, real estate agents, people in advertising and car salesmen. I still think that is not a good position. Now, although leadership and these sort of popularity issues are interesting, they're fun and they get on TV because they're kind of interesting to talk about, really important to remember that that's not what the election is about. The election is about the issues that really matter. And as we said earlier, when we ask people what are the issues that matter, it's all about the economy. So the result of this year's federal election will be all about economics. Now, while previous governments, particularly the Labor government, the last Labor government, faced the issue of how and whether and how to redistribute all the wealth that was coming from the mining boom. Would we have a mining tax? Would we have a mining super profits tax? And how would we ameliorate the problems that this massive mining boom was causing for the environment? Would we have a carbon tax? Those were the issues that the Labor Party was considering. Today, and the next new government will have a very different set of issues to deal with. They will be dealing with things like the socio-economic and political issues associated with the end of the mining boom. They'll be dealing with the reliance of the Australian economy, apparently on a renewed housing boom or a continued housing and real estate boom. The end of the mining booms particularly being felt in Western Australia, which has seen a massive collapse in revenue in the last few years. But the most visible impact today of the end of the mining boom is in South Australian town of Whyalla. So where we see the steel manufacturer in administration and facing closure of its steel plants. And as I think I said earlier, something like 10,000 Australian jobs will go. So it's a very different environment that this government has to operate within, and the next government, obviously. Now, we tend, I suppose, when we put all of this data together, you actually start to think about these things from a structural perspective. You think about employment, you think about trends, you think about all of those things. There's a very important human perspective to this as well. So for most people, they're not thinking about structural issues. They're actually thinking about things like the cost of living. And the cost of living comes up as a really strong word and phrase from people in the electorate. Most people are actually thinking, will I keep my job? Will my kids get a job? Will my family, my husband, my wife, my friends, my whatever, be able to keep their job? Because we all know if you've got a job, you're okay. We know throughout the global financial crisis, those people who kept their jobs were okay. Those who didn't lose their jobs, their life changed extraordinarily. So people are thinking about their own jobs, their family jobs, the cost of living. They're thinking about those normal human issues, not just the kind of economic lines that we've been talking about so far. And that's really why it's so incredibly important to look at the big issue of unemployment. We see unemployment as Australia's major issue, and as I said earlier, it's travelling at 10.7%. That's 1.37 million Australians unemployed, and another almost 947,000 underemployed. They've got some part-time work, they really want full-time work. 2.3 million Australians being affected by this at the moment. And many of you will have seen this chart before. Keep looking at it. The Roy Morgan real unemployment figure, the blue figure, is clearly much larger than the government stats, which would see us having unemployment still at around 5.7%, pretty much unchanged over the last little while. And that means two things. One, it means the policymakers are making the wrong decisions. Does anyone else feel sick when a politician stands up and says, we don't have an unemployment problem in this country, so I'm going to do blah, blah, blah? Does anyone else feel really, really devastated? I do. And clearly, the majority of Australians actually don't believe it either. When we ask Australians whether they think the real unemployment figure is around that 5 or 6% that the government's saying, or more like the 10% that Roy Morgan's saying, the vast majority for the last few years has said they believe the Roy Morgan figure. The population don't think we don't have an unemployment problem. And that's the second point. If you don't believe that if you don't believe there's no unemployment problem, and the government's telling you there's no unemployment problem, you don't believe the government. It's a very, very important point. And of course, we all know that unemployment hits young people pretty hard. And of course, it hits older people as well. But we see young people at 16% unemployment That's a big issue. This is the starting point when they should be getting skills and moving into the workforce. Now, we did some really interesting analysis. I don't know if it was my idea or Julian's, but it was a really good idea anyway, on how people vote when they're in different levels of employment. We've never looked at this before. We have all the data, we're really data rich, but we hadn't looked at this before. So what did we find? When people are in private industry, how do they vote? Probably no surprises here. Most of them vote LNP ahead of the ALP. Now, this is a primary vote, so that's why the two major parties don't add up. You've got some Greens and others. Hold that thought. No surprises. How does self-employed vote? No surprises there. Self-employed people support the LNP way, way over the ALP, more than twice. Does anyone find this surprising? I find it really surprising. When we ask people in the public service or the public sector, how are they voting? Now, if you guys have been here before, I often stand up and say a Conservative government has real trouble because its public service, its arms and legs, are traditionally Labor voters. Well, I have to stop saying that. Look at what's happened. Over the last little while, even the public service has actually supported the LNP over the ALP. This is extraordinary.
Not if you add the Greens.
We're not going to add the Greens to it, Gary. He's never here when I need him, and he's always here to be a nuisance. Yes, if you add the Greens, you can actually, but even the Greens aren't doing too well. But anyway, the Labor Party has lost support. Now, what is that about? Is it about the unions, the very strong union issues that are coming through? Is it about corruption allegations? What is it about? We don't know. This is a really simple crosstab that actually shows how they're voting, but very, very interesting and a really serious change. Full-time employed people, no real surprises, they're voting LNP. Part-time employed people, not too surprised. I would have thought that part-time people would be somewhere between full-time and not employed. So they're coming out more strongly LNP, but not surprising. This is a really telling chart. If we look at people who are unemployed, you wouldn't be surprised to find them voting Labor. You know, when you're unemployed, you actually need people to kind of protect the situation. You're not thinking of structural issues. If you don't have a job, you're not looking at the Australia for the future, the smart country that's going to find jobs for somebody but not you. You're actually looking for a safety net. You're looking to make sure you're okay. So it's not surprising they vote Labor, but look at that downward trajectory over the last little while, even among the unemployed. These were very interesting and important charts. And again, focused on the fact that unemployment really matters. Now, coming back to the US, Janet Yellen, the US federal chairman, is also aware, like Donald Trump, of the larger number of unemployed Americans than are usually noted, is the language they use. Are our Australian politicians, are our Australian policymakers aware of this and just ignoring it? Or do they just not know? Are they not listening to us? Unfortunately, appears, whatever, they're not. So that means that this large cohort of people who are unemployed and underemployed will not be engaged properly, will not be recorded, will not be noted, will not have policies made structurally or for them to actually deal with the situation. Now, don't be afraid of this chart. It's a really important chart and I'm going to step you through it. So we have Australia in blue and we have the US in red. Can people hear me if I step away? Yeah? Okay. So if we look at even the ABS, the narrowest definition of unemployment, we actually see the ABS and the USA, their same measure of unemployment, about the same, running here. Then you have the global financial crisis. Unemployment, by their own government measure in America, takes off. Unemployment goes up, not surprising. They expected that. They had a real global financial crisis. Now it's come down again, below Australia. Australia really didn't have a global financial crisis. We thought we were going to, but it tapered off. But even at this narrow measure, we now have a higher level of unemployment than America does. Then let's look at the real numbers. So in America, they have lots of things. They have U1, U2, U3, U4, all these different levels of unemployment. The ones that are kind of interesting, U3 is the one they normally report, like the ABS does here. And the other one they often report is the U6, which they call something like underutilisation. And it's essentially unemployed plus underemployed. which is the same as the Roy Morgan, unemployed and underemployed. And what you actually find is that in the early days, 2005, 6, 7, Americans had less underutilisation than Australia did. Global financial crisis, underutilisation took off. Need a pointer or something, I'm not tall enough. Really high for America, and now it's come down, 9.7. Look at the Australian line. It has continued to get worse. There is no sign of improvement in that underutilisation measure. This is it's another measure of what we've been saying for a really long time. We have an unemployment problem in Australia. And it has consequences. So we hear lots of complaints about major companies not paying tax. And that's a problem because we need money to go into the tax coffers so that we can do wonderful things. We hear complaints about companies not paying the appropriate superannuation for their employees because that, again, doesn't provide tax, does other things as well. Another really big issue, of course, is the cash economy. Because with the cash economy, you lose tax all the way around. There's no super, there's no pay-as-you-go tax, there's no money going into the taxation system at all with the cash economy. And then unemployment is an absolute double whammy. You have a loss of tax, you actually have payments being paid, social security payments being paid to people, and that's before we even consider the multiplier effect of people who are working, spending money. And it's before you consider the real social and mental health problems associated with unemployment. So there is no way that we can consider that unemployment is not a big issue. It hits everything that matters when it comes to the economy. It hits everything that matters when it comes to what the government needs to be thinking about. We now look then at what are the wildcards. Because it looks as if the Malcolm Turnbull government will be returned, probably with a reduced majority, but what are the wildcards? What are the things that could happen? Number one, terrorism. This is always a wild card in this country. Since Tampa, which actually changed an election to, just really quickly, terrorism has always got to be seen as a kind of sleeper. And that mass shooting in Orlando, in Florida, on the weekend brings terrorism to the fore of our mind again. The fact that the guy who did the shooting was actually Islamic, whether it's part of ISIS or not, is irrelevant. It brings the whole issue to the front of our mind and we start thinking about terrorism. And any of these terrorism or security issues of any kind play well for the government in power, whichever one it is. They play particularly well for a Conservative government, and particularly well for a Conservative government like we've had that's been very, very strong on border patrol or border control. So any kind of terrorism issue that raises an issue for us will play to the LNP. On the other hand, there are issues floating around unions and corruption, and they seem to be popping up everywhere. It's probably all about timing. We don't know what the next one will be. We don't know what the next claim about corruption will be, where it's going to hit, which side of politics is going to be hit. I think the real question is when. Will it happen this week? Will it happen next week? Or will it happen after the election, in which case it won't have an opportunity to make a difference? But these are the kinds of things that could be wild cards and could change everything. I have to say, with something like Tampa, the children overboard, it's unlikely that a kind of, a made-up event like that could actually happen this time. And I say that perhaps naively, optimistically, but I think with social media, what you've got is something like that happened. The expose of it not being real would have happened a lot more quickly. Somebody would have known, somebody would have got that message out. So we are living in a very different situation than we were living at the time that actually happened. So in summary, the elevation of Malcolm Turnbull to the top job looks like it's done what was needed to be done for the LNP, which is probably secure victory at next few weeks federal election. The trend of the last few weeks is favouring the Turnbull government, and international events may actually provide the next level of support that is needed. To win support in his own right, with a small swing against him, is what we think is probably the most likely outcome. We expect the LNP will be returned with a majority of something like 78 to 84 seats in the lower house, but well short of anything like a majority in the Senate. So with that reduced majority in the Senate, Turnbull will be under real pressure and immediate pressure from the Liberal backbenchers, who really only put him in there to improve the situation, improve the fortunes of the government. It'll take all of his leadership skills to keep those Liberal and National backbenchers united behind his leadership, especially when the economy runs into trouble as deflation continues around the world. Now, just in case anyone's feeling kind of too happy, I've just got one more sort of slab of bad news. So I think there are several challenges that will face the next government, including the departure of the Australian car industry. Ford finishes manufacturing this year, and then we've got Holden and Toyota closing their Australian manufacturing operations next year. Heavy job losses at several of the large mining and energy companies, including Santos, Chevron, Glencore, BHP, Shell, Caltex and others, provide an ongoing challenge for the government and also show how the Australian economy is now basically relying very much on real estate and a housing industry boom. And the most recently potential close of Whyalla, again, is going to be a major issue for the country. In addition, the ruling against Coles in this whole enterprise agreement situation, enterprise bargaining agreement with the unions, is going to be sending a shiver up the spine of many companies. Many will be, feeling really uncertain about their own enterprise agreement. And that uncertainty isn't good for any economy. So people will be thinking, okay, we've got an enterprise agreement, tick, don't need to worry about that. They'll now be thinking, well, is our enterprise agreement, is it still making sure that nobody's worse off? And if it's not, they could be in the firing line next. And that will be really extraordinary. And of course, there'll still be other franchisees who are probably doing the same sorts of things as 7-Eleven was doing, and they'll be all quaky. So we've got a whole range of industries across the board that will be feeling quite negative. But all that's to come, and we've got another couple of weeks to go until election day. It'll be an interesting time, not boring at all. Thank you.